in psychology, we're always making dualisms of one kind or another. And so I wrote down a bunch of this versus that statements that I think kind of characterize some of the thoughts and discussions that we've had at the meeting. And I just want to go through the list. And then after I do that, we're going to bring up two discussants who will either comment on this list that I've made or maybe bring up other things. I mean, the subtitle of this conference was From Mind to Brain and Back Again. This is actually the title of a freshman course I teach at NYU every year. And I think in this conference, we started with the brain and went to the mind and into philosophy and social science at the end. And maybe we'll come back and try to make this a true circle rather than just moving in one direction here in the discussion. So here are some of the points that I picked up on as we went through these 2 days. We had emotional versus non-emotional states. We had feeling versus body responses, animal versus human emotions, conscious versus non-conscious, high road, low road, implicit, explicit, attended, unattended, mind versus soul, brain versus mind, brain versus embodied emotion, brain emotion versus embodied emotion, emotional brain defined by conserved circuits versus emotion words related to feelings, positive negative valence versus emotional categories, adult versus infant emotion, cognitive versus non-cognitive appraisal, emotional reactivity versus emotional action, emotion versus motivation, purposive versus goal-directed, emotional expression versus regulation, normative or average versus individual variability, learned versus innate, cultural versus universal, oscillatory versus non-oscillatory, healthy versus pathological emotion, organic versus functional pathology, neurological versus psychiatric disorder, reason versus emotion, rational versus irrational emotion, intrinsic versus instrumental rationality, normativity versus ontologicality, and then we had philosophy of science and philosophy in science. So I know this is a long list, and there's no way we can talk about even a third of all of this, but I'd like to invite the two discussants to come up and begin to just comment on whatever they would like to comment. We have one discussant from the humanities, social sciences, and philosophy, and the other discussant from the neuroscience, cognitive science angle. So, please, take the stage. Nadim, would you like to start?
Mine is a low battery, so don't lose hope, because within 3 minutes there will be no... So we didn't talk about that, which means we didn't prepare anything, so this show is spontaneous. The first thing that I reached, the first conclusion that I reached is that, maybe I'll stand here because this doesn't work well and it resonates, it echoes. Joe, the first conclusion that I reached was that human memory is very limited, because when you started reading your oppositions, I started writing it, and then I had to write from memory because you read very quickly because you have an iPhone. And after I reached 4, I reached the idea that working memory is 7 plus minus 3 is wrong. It's actually 4, because I stopped here. So there is no way I can comment on anything after maybe the first 20% of your list, and no thanks. And I'm sure that we can comment on other things. So I wish to just to comment on 3 things that you said, that you raised. You didn't say the issue of emotional versus non-emotional that was brought up here, actually starting from the first talk. And then implicit versus explicit, which is related. And then the third one, which I liked very much, which is philosophy of science versus philosophy in science. So on the first two, I have to say very little, and therefore, and the things I will say are probably almost redundant, but I think that formally, there isn't a thing like non-emotion. This is my feeling, and I try to convey that. And this is my emotion, actually. I said feeling. I try to convey that because I think that emotion has developed, but that's a view everybody can pose to, of course, because I have no arguments but my emotions on that. That emotion is a sort of a system that has developed, probably developed in evolution to enable the organism to monitor, evaluate, appraise, and sort of mold the right reaction. And then only later in evolution, when the threshold, again, it's my view, the threshold for consciousness was crossed, then feeling came. And then they were maybe supervenient, I don't know, superimposed on the systems that were there before. So I'm not claiming, where is Bartosz? I'm not claiming that these are modular systems, not at all. What I'm claiming is that it's like an iceberg that you see only the 5 or 3 or 10% of it, and most of it is under the water. And whenever you reach something that is super, sort of crossing the threshold of this huge sea of implicit things, you start to have feelings. And I find it very difficult to see situations under which we don't have feeling at all. It's just that on the spectrum of intensity, some are stronger, some are less, and maybe those that are stronger are related to issues that are more important from a phylogenetic point of view. So fear is extremely important, and therefore it's a strong feeling. Maybe love is extremely important, it's a strong feeling. But my feeling about traveling somewhere, not to this place, which is very strong, but traveling somewhere is probably not strong because it doesn't occupy such a crucial role in survival, unless you travel with, I don't know which airline you can choose, and then it's very important for survival.
Can I comment on your first point?
Sure. Although, just a minute, it's actually related. I want to get rid of the second one, which is implicit versus explicit. The more I study the brain, and I know very little because I study a very small part of it, but I try to read, I somehow became more and more convinced that something which probably my mother would have said without any studies in brain sciences, that most of our life is implicit, and that the tiny things that we see as explicit have their roots somewhere there. And this refers to emotions as well. So because the feelings are only sort of a tiny portion of this system. But now I stop here because the last comment I want to make is about philosophy in science and philosophy of science.
Okay, so let's just talk about that for a second. I mean, last night I brought up the example of bacteria, and I wasn't just joking about that because from the bacteria you can see that they have this ability to detect and respond to things that are necessary for their survival. And in many ways, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about emotion. And so rather than emotion being something that is out of the ordinary or unusual, which we often talk about it as, it's just life is emotion in a way. It's the ability for our homeostatic systems to constantly be adjusting themselves under the control of the brain as the local environment changes. And sometimes this filters up, breaks through the barrier of consciousness, and then we experience it. But otherwise, it's just life.
So I think that I almost tend to agree with you. The only issue that I didn't sort of made up my mind myself is whether a real nervous system is required for that. As you well know, there were nice papers describing learning and memory in bacteria by Dan Koshland. And I had lots of arguments with him. We actually had almost a book written on, on exchanges between us. And I somehow felt that one should make some distinction. I'm not so sure about that now. The minute you start having a nervous system, you probably have something more dedicated to perception and action and so on and so on. And he claimed, look, a bacterium is a single nervous system, which might be right. So I think that if we take it ad absurdum, but not in the negative connotation, then indeed emotion has some rudiments in unicellular organism as well.
But yeah, I mean, we don't have to go too seriously towards the bacteria. We could start with the nervous system.
Can aplesia be sad?
Sad, no.
Aplesia is not sad?
Sad?
Yeah.
If by sadness you mean the feeling of remorse or...
No. So can aplesia, well, aplesia fears, we know that.
It depends.
It depends, yeah. So, but aplesia is very proud because it got the Nobel Prize.
Right.
Yeah, so that's...
so on that, maybe we should turn to your third point.
Yeah, coming to think about it. So, my third point is very brief, and I liked your presentation very much. And the reason is that I claim that many of us, if not all, but not explicitly, who do research on the brain or do science in other disciplines are actually active philosophers, which means the questions we deal on a daily basis are questions of philosophy. And we are active philosophers, but sometimes we refuse to confess this is what we do, because philosophy as such in the natural sciences has the connotation of just sitting there and thinking.
I think it upsets much less the scientists, but it upsets a lot more the philosophers, because the philosophers, I mean, at least of the very classical breed, would maintain that philosophy is as a sort of a higher level reflection, which sort of reflects on the ultimate causes, and the scientists deal with the world, with everything that's sort of empirical, and that's sort of a lower thing. So I think what we're doing here, we're by saying that actually as we do science, we philosophize. I think that comes out of the practice of scientists, but I think philosophers would very much, the philosophers of the humanist breed would contest that quite a bit.
So it's interesting at least from my point of view, if I look at philosophy of science faculties in universities, I usually find the following. Most of them, because I cannot generalize, I just do it by talking to people or looking at the websites, most of them do indeed philosophy that relates to physics. B, most of them, I'm not generalizing too much, don't take it personally, most of them do history of science.
Mm-hmm. That's
they
correct.
don't do philosophy. So many of those who would claim, look, you have to, you're at a certain level of looking for the data or trying to find generalization, and we are at, you said higher level, I didn't say higher level, you cited them. And we are thinking about the generalizations and how to philosophize on that. Most of them actually describe things that happened and trying to explain why did scientists reach their conclusions. And very few of them would even try to generalize before the science is being done, which for me is the pinnacle of philosophy. Because the minute I have science done, in the life sciences, I try to find out how the machinery works. I try to find out what are the predictions of that machinery. This is active philosophy because there is no other way we can approach the issues. The other way is religious, which I recommend a book by Michael Heller. Where is he? Michael's right there. He's right there. Oh, he's here. Yeah, he's hiding. Which for me was, in a way, a revelation. I started reading it last night, and I indeed lost the opportunity to drink some vodka in the city, but I enjoyed it very much. Maybe even, I didn't reach much. I read the first 15 pages or something like this. And so, yes, the feeling that philosophy is detached from the scientific doing.
Oh yes, it's very much so.
The idea of interdisciplinary.
Yeah, I mean, especially as I said, philosophy of science is our reflection on why we, in general, why we can tell that science gives us knowledge. So I think it's like a prerequisite in some ways to even start doing science. So it's, I mean, as we do science, it's in the background, it's all in action.
So if I try to be a bit more practical, although philosophy usually is not favoring, some philosophy that I know is not favoring that, I would say that one thing that I would love to see in the curriculum of my students is at least a basic course on philosophical methods, because without the methods you can practice nothing. Mm-hmm. And the appreciation that there are philosophical methods, there is a philosophical vocabulary, there is a lot of philosophical history, but not in terms of who said what, but in terms of the ideas that developed. One thing that I find very difficult in dealing with philosophy is indeed the emphasis on who said what, instead of trying to generalize. In science, we don't do that usually.
Yeah, it's a very important thought, because like if you look at the writings, for example, of Heisenberg or writing of Einstein, they will very strongly say that, that their philosophical education was crucial in their entire regime of thought. So, and I personally think you cannot disengage. You cannot slice the history of human thought. I mean, philosophy and science is somehow come out of philosophy, and it drags a lot of that heritage with itself. So I don't think we can actually say, well, this is where philosophy ends and science starts. I mean, this is an entire history of human thought which has brought us to, for example, to a stage at which we can do science, because we developed such a precise conceptual systems which are actually fit to do precise science. But that's not something has come out of the blue. It's a long history of human thought.
So I think if there were a possibility to have a message, it's not the intention of this. But if I had to write a document, I'm not proposing to write it. I would have said one of the recommendations would be to have in the education of cognitive sciences and neuroscience. In the education of cognitive science and neurosciences, I would love to see, among others, education in the tools of philosophy, and not necessarily in what happens now when we try to introduce courses on philosophy of science. We try to do it in our place. When we tried, we got a course on the history of physics. No, I would like to see something more on the methodology used, on what are the tools of the trade, what is the vocabulary. So when I talk with you, we at least share some vocabulary, understand where we don't understand. And this is something very important, especially because cognitive sciences touch upon these very critical questions to the human situation.
Yeah, I think your point is very, very important, because oftentimes, even if you, again, I'll switch to physicists. When you talk to physicists, oftentimes you find out they exercise their method, but sometimes the awareness of actually, I like to put it the question that way: what does a physicist do when he does physics? Really, what happens, right? And I think a course in the philosophy of science, even given for physicists or for biologists or for cognitive sciences, would very much help to get in touch with the heritage of human thought, of the entire legacy of our Western tradition or whatever, and then to provide the tools. What does a physicist do when he does physics? That's my question.
So why don't we, did you have anything you wanted to say first before we turn it over to the
audience? Yeah, as far as in regards to the different dualities you've mentioned, I think even the Greeks have noticed, or that's the way they had done, that it actually helps for people to explain things, to see things in categories of sharp dualities, to make contrasts. So I think it's a very much of a human way of acting, that we're trying to conceptualize things in terms of opposites, because then it helps to understand. And this is what has been happening, I think, in the history of thought, especially that a lot of the dualist concepts came up, like, for example, let's say the Platonic idea of the sensual versus the world of the metaphor of the cave, where you have the world of ideas and then the world of material. The world of the material shades. So actually this is I think it's a very deep, something deep in us, that we immediately try to put things in terms of dualities, in terms of contrasts. That helps us to understand.
Yeah, may I just start saying that? Because this is a beautiful example of how the interaction, in my view, between cognitive sciences and philosophy might illuminate things from probably a novel, not original, but a novel point of view. I think that indeed we tend to practice dualities, but cognitive sciences would come and say, yes, but there is a reason for that. Probably the most important cognitive apparatus, again, it's my view, that enables the human mind to function the way it does, is working memory. Working memory has a very limited capacity. Mm-hmm. You must chunk things in order to play with them. So there is no other way but to have these dualities.
Okay, on that point, why don't we turn it over to the audience and open up the discussion?
This is a very shy audience.
Could we hear from some of the students?
I liked very much your last remark about how working memory is very limited. But I would like to add to that what I was thinking. I was also very inspired by the philosophy of this conference, is that the brain itself is very limited. And I think in the dual pathway model that I talked about today and that Joe talked about yesterday, is really a great example of how evolution tries to come up with an optimal solution for a very difficult problem. So you want to respond to the world, but and you want to respond fast to the world or to the stimuli that you perceive, but it's hard. So you make a mistake sometimes, or maybe often, but making a mistake is not as bad as making a bigger mistake, and that is responding slower or responding wrong to a real threat. So that's one example where the brain is limited in time and representational capacities, but the brain is also very limited in the energy that it can use. And I think that's a very important aspect of the brain that people often forget in their evolutionary reasoning. And especially for evolutionary reasoning in behavior, because the brain is such an expensive tissue that often it might be more wise to have a cheap brain that makes mistakes every now and then than to have a brain that always does the right thing. And that's one thing that I thought of that I might add to the discussion, because I think for emotions that's an important aspect because of the motivational systems that are involved in emotions. So if I may illustrate a simple example from well, I forgot where I read it, but if I may illustrate a simple example that I was just talking to Aaron about. It's about reported behavior in birds where they respond really well to their offspring, where they want to feed their offspring and put food in the colored beaks of their offspring. So a bird is flying to collect food, and it flies back to its nest to feed its young, but then halfway it accidentally spots an unrelated nest with other young, with their mouths open. And then it can't resist the urge to put food in their mouths. And there's no evolutionary explanation for why it might be beneficial for feeding the other young. Let's assume there's no genetic connection or whatever. But the idea is that to judge correctly in what situation you should put food in a beak and in what situation you shouldn't, to have a brain that always does this, that makes the correct judgment, that is then a really expensive brain. And to have such a brain is much more costly than accepting that every now and then you make a mistake. So I think that's also beautifully exemplified by the dual pathway model. But I think it's much more prevalent in the brain, and as also especially in emotional systems.
Okay, thank you very much. Would anyone else from the audience like to speak? Okay. Could we get you a microphone? And also in the back, we'll get you the next microphone.
I just want to point out one obvious limitation. The brain is limited because the life of a human being is limited in time.
Okay, very nice point. And
Thank you for reminding me.
I guess it's nice.
Well, I have come to this conference in hope to listen to to hear the solution of the urgent problem with emotion that bothers me from some time. And I was trying to participate in this conference diligently, yet I don't find this problem being addressed directly. So let me do this right now. So in fact, Joseph Ledoux had enumerated in before, and it is cognitive versus non-cognitive appraisal. Because I'd like to refer now to a science called affective neuroscience, and as proponents of its advocate that the affective neuroscience is something different from cognitive neuroscience because of the nature of emotional processes, and it's something, I don't know, special or characteristic in emotional processes that differs them very qualitatively much from what we call cognitive processes, and that's why affective neuroscience cannot be a part of cognitive neuroscience. Yet the cognitive neuroscientists claim that if we define cognitive science, neuro or cognitive science in a broader sense, which includes that cognitive science deals with everything what is mental, and if we agree that emotions are mental, then affective neuroscience is a part of cognitive neuroscience. So if it was clear, so that would be...
Yes, I'd like to comment on that. I mean, the field of cognitive science emerged obviously as a response to behaviorism, and it didn't include affective or emotion in it originally. So as a response to that, a field called affective neuroscience begins to percolate up. But I think at this point we're really better off going back to psychology rather than dividing the mind into different parts and studying them. What we care about is how the mental apparatus works in the brain, how it controls behavior, how it responds to various things. And in every kind of situation that we engage in, there'll be cognitive processes and emotional processes, and it's a bit of an artificial distinction. So it's important, I think, this is just my opinion on all this, of course, but I think, we would be better off now that we've kind of brought emotion and cognition back into psychology to drop both of these terms, cognitive and affective neuroscience, and just go back to how psychological function relates to the brain.
I would like to ask you, don't you think that a little bit discussion about emotions it's overestimated because if we define or we try to see emotions from cognitive perspective, in fact there are some changes of how the cognitive architecture reacts or behaves. That results from changes of the situation of the cognitive architecture against their goals. In fact, emotions are quite formal. I mean, the goals is something that is quite stable, and I think it's much more valuable to talk about the goals from a philosophical point of view if we are observing the human behavior. I mean, that emotions is not something that shall be in the focus when we are searching. I mean, doing some research in human behavior, even from a philosophical perspective.
So, Liz, would you like to? You're a cognitive scientist and you study emotion. Would you like to comment on that?
Pardon?
Liz is going to comment.
So I was unclear as to you were arguing that emotion should not be part of the study of cognition. I was quite a little unclear as to what.
They are not the most important. I mean that from philosophical point of view, especially if you are interested in human behavior, I mean emotions is something that doesn't affect our behavior. It's in fact emotions are something. I mean, they are reactions of our organism, of our mechanism, cognitive mechanism on our changes.
You know, my argument with that would be it's a two-way street. So, you know, for instance, today I presented some data suggesting that something affective can change, you know, the amount of contrast you see in a stimulus. You know, so if emotion and to me they aren't cleanly separable at all, and the brain systems that we often talk about as being involved in emotion are intertwined, you know, in a reciprocal manner with almost every system that we can think of as being involved in cognition. And so I think one of the primary things that brain science has taught us in thinking about emotion in the brain is that there was never a clean division between our cognitions and our emotions, that we actually cannot separate the two in a clean manner at all, and so we can't really, you know, talk about emotion not playing a role in any behavior that we have. The best we can do is try to understand what that role is, you know, when emotion plays a strong role or a small role. But I don't think there's any cognitive behavior you can think of where we're not going to see an impact of emotion, even if it's a subtle impact. So I guess, you know, I would argue that we can't learn about cognition if we don't include in that the study of our emotions.
Okay, and we had a question here. Would you still like the microphone?
I have one question. First, I'd like to say that I have nothing in common with neuroscience. That's why my question may not be very specific, but I mean, it was a great honor to be here and to listen to so many profound lectures. Paraphrasing Professor Grigiel, everybody uses the same brain, and that's why it is so fascinating to listen about the brain. But I have a general question or a remark. As far as I was listening to those beautiful lectures, I got an impression that there was so much about fear. For example, I found out, and it was a very interesting thing, that fear can be a factor. I'm reading because I made some notes. It can be a factor which boosts the process of learning, which can be a reinforcement in the process of learning. Then on the other lecture, I found out that the neuronal activity of amygdala is not an activity concerned with negative emotions only, but also with positives. Then I found out that, so I was just wondering, does fear differ somehow from other feelings that it was so often testing here? I mean, was fear so widely studied because simply it is the emotion which is extreme, and that's why it was studied so easily? Or was it tested so often just from the prosaic reason that it is easy to observe fear as far as, for example, rats are concerned, because some of those researches were on rats? I mean, or maybe there were, I'm just not aware, some researches on other extreme feelings, like, for example, love, because that conclusion that only fear can boost the process of learning could be, I mean, quite gloomy for me.
So the first answer is that fear is not the only emotion that can affect learning or any other psychological process. All emotional states will do that. The answer to the bigger question you ask, which is why so much work on fear, I can only answer in terms of my own research why I've focused on fear. I actually started out doing this research because I was interested in how emotions work in the big picture sense, you know, what an emotion is, how it works in the brain. And I was doing this in studies of humans who have split brain surgery. And I observed in my PhD research that we could put a stimulus into the right hemisphere of the patient, and the left hemisphere couldn't tell us what the stimulus was, but it could rate the emotional quality of the stimulus as good or bad. So that suggested that the perceptual stimulus, somehow, that the stimulus comes into the brain, but then its perceptual and its emotional qualities are somehow separated along neural pathways. And so I wanted to understand how this works in the broad sense of what emotion is. So when I decided to do that, I said I have to do this in animals because we didn't have imaging or other fancy techniques at that point. So I said, well, how am I going to do this in a rat? I looked around, and there was a very interesting task called Pavlovian fear conditioning, where you could take a stimulus that had no meaning and give it an emotional meaning in a single trial. So I thought this was a very useful task, and I started using that. And I did it because I thought I could study emotion with it. But as the years went by, I realized I was really studying this kind of fear defense system, and that other emotions might be somewhat different. So I started talking about my own research in terms of fear rather than in terms of emotion in general. So the answer is that so much work has been done on fear because they're good tools for studying it in animals, and you can apply those same tools to the human brain the way that Liz has done and others have done like that. So it's kind of a practical rather than a conceptual strategy that has driven, I think, a lot of the work.
May I just add to it that I think, although I'm not the expert on fear, except personal fear, but I think that even in humans, the practical considerations are extremely important. So there might be emotions in humans that are extremely interesting, but how are you going to control them in the lab? How are you going to control them within, let's say, minutes or seconds or even hours and have it reproducible? So fear fits that very well.
And it also ends up having lots of clinical implications, so it kind of reinforces the work as well. So, but Liz had something you want to say?
Was there any research on love at all? Was there any?
There are people who have put partners who do love in the brain scanner, just to see what happens, right? But they aren't controlling love. They aren't able to, those are correlational studies. We can learn from them. We can observe that. And there's a lot of social psychologists who study factors that go into, good marriages and love that lasts and different kinds of love. But you can't manipulate it in the laboratory, so you're never going to get the same amount of information about what causes this. And fear is one of the easiest ones to manipulate. Even something like happiness. I can give you money. I don't know if that makes you happy, right? That's a reward. That's what we might try to do, but it's not the same thing as what you might call happiness. So, and a lot of these emotions have a sort of a subjective component to them. You know, and as scientists, we want to get something other than kind of what you say on a scale sometimes. So I just think, you know, Yadin's point is completely right. When you know, at this point, and the study of emotion in the brain is very new, especially in humans. Not so much in other species, but especially in humans. So, you know, we're doing the easy stuff right now. I think, you know, as the field progresses, you know, we're going to learn more about other emotions, and but some of the things we're never going to be able to use a sort of classic experimental method for.
Michael, would you like to say anything to give us inspiration here towards the end? No? Well, I think the hour is late, and we've had a great 2 days and some interesting discussions today. So I want to thank Michael and Bartosz and all of the Copernicus Center again for this wonderful conference. So let's all join in giving them.
So since I am provoked, I must say something. There is a French proverb which says, partire mourir un peu, which means living, starting a journey, is like dying a little. This is why I don't like when the conference like that one is about to end. But in order to make the things easier, I would like to thank to everybody who contributed to that conference. First of all, my gratitude goes to Joe Ledoux. We shall certainly be emotionally linked with him more than so far. And I hope that this emotion and this relation will be reciprocal. The same refers to all other speakers, and I hope that sometimes when they will be playing with the internet, they will visit the Copernicus Center site and remember these few days spent in Kraków. I thank also the audience, our faithful audience, especially those who remained with us till the very end. And all those people without whom this conference would not be possible. I would say that, to use a metaphor, that amygdala of our conference are two people. Dr. Bartosz Brożek and Dr. Janusz Mączka, who is also the Dean of the Faculty of the Pontifical University here in Kraków. And without them, not only this conference would not be possible, but without them also the Copernicus Center would stop functioning. I must say something about the organizing committee. Several people who are not always visible to us, but who work very hardly behind the scene. I will, with gratitude, enumerate their names. Wojciech Grygiel, we know him, Łukasz Kurek, Piotr Urbańczyk, Mateusz Chochol, Janusz Dobroszewski, Małgorzata Stawarz i Aleksandra Sadowska. Thank you very much, and we will count on you on the next occasions. And these beautiful pictures, the authors of them is Professor Adam Valanus. I don't know whether you are aware of the fact that he is a professor at the Technical University here in Kraków. And he is an old friend of Copernicus Center. If you visit our site, you could see his pictures from many conferences and other occasions. And I am a little bit afraid of him, I must say, because I am afraid that our conferences will be more famous because of his pictures than because of our efforts. But thank you very much indeed. And I must say that this is only the part of these pictures, the only selection of pictures. There are pictures made yesterday, much more of them, and there are pictures made today, which were not shown. But they will be on the internet tomorrow. You are free to visit. No? On Monday. On Monday they will be available because probably of a great number of them. So you will have an occasion to enjoy all of them. And the internet address is the name of Professor Valanus, adamvalanus.pl, and you can see, and you can also take a link from Copernicus Center site. Well, we are full of emotions, and we also grasped a little bit of philosophy in science. And to have a pretext to come back here to Krakow, we can promise that one of our next conferences will be on the philosophy in science, and science contains also neurosciences and everything we were talking about these 2 days. So you are most welcome to come here, also without any pretext, just to see Krakow and to meet us again. Thank you, and see you as soon as possible. Thank you.